would you do if you truly wanted to intimidate and decided to let it all out? But in that moment, your younger brother walked into your room and caught you in the act. Now, you'll find out what I did. My name is Scarlett, I'm 22 years old, and this happened some time ago. A few weeks back, I returned home for the fall holidays. To give some context, I hadn't been home in more than 2 years because I had been studying on another continent. But finally, the stars aligned, and I booked a ticket back. It was incredibly emotional with my parents, just the overwhelming feeling of being home again after so long. And then, Brad appeared. Brad is my younger brother. We grew up together, so we were always close. He's a bit younger than me, a lanky and awkward boy back then. Practically my shadow during our childhood. He always followed me around. But now, wow, when he walked in, I barely recognized him. The skinny, shy boy I remembered had transformed into a man standing over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying a quiet confidence. It was as if he had stepped straight out of one of those Instagram photo shoots, with highlights and everything, wearing a fitted black shirt. I hugged him, feeling the muscle in his back. It was surreal. "You've grown," I said, stepping back, genuinely surprised. He laughed, scratching his neck. "It happens." But it wasn't just his looks. He smelled incredible. I don't know if it was his cologne or just him, but he caught me off guard for the rest of the evening. I kept noticing small things I had never paid attention to before. His laugh was deeper, his eyes carried that calm energy. It was like meeting someone new, yet I'd known him all my life. Well, let me get straight to the point. That first night back, after all the hugs, catching up, and stuffing myself with my mom's food, her famous lasagna left me completely drained. I traveled over 18 hours with layovers and delays. It had sapped every bit of energy from me. So, after we finally said goodnight, I headed upstairs, showered, and collapsed into my old room. Now, my old room was practically untouched since I'd left. My parents had converted parts of the house into a guest room, but they had left all my posters, my bookshelf filled with fantasy novels, and even some of my high school stuff scattered around. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Nostalgia hit me hard, but honestly, all I wanted was to crawl into bed and pass out. So, I took a shower, letting the hot water wash away the stiffness from the plane ride. It was incredible, like the first real moment of peace I'd had in weeks. Once I was done, I threw on an oversized t-shirt, turned off the lights, and slid under the blankets in my room. It was cool, cozy, and so quiet. The kind of peace only your childhood home can offer. I don't know if it was the jet lag, the stress of school fading away, or maybe just the way Brad had reappeared in my life, looking like that. But as I lay there in the darkness, my mind began to wander. Honestly, it had been so long since I'd experienced any kind of intimacy, a very long time. Between school, work, and life in general, I simply hadn't had the time or, honestly, the energy to connect with someone in that way. So, I thought, why not take a little time for myself? I mean, I was alone, the house was silent, and it seemed like the perfect moment to relax. I closed my eyes and let my hands roam, simply brushing them over my skin to start. The sensation was soft, comforting, like a way of reconnecting with myself. My fingertips brushed over my lips, then my neck, and I felt a warmth growing inside me. But my mind betrayed me because, out of nowhere, Brad's face appeared in my thoughts. It wasn't planned, but there he was, his sharp jawline, the way his hair and lips were slightly tousled. That quiet confidence he carried now. I felt a warmth in my chest and then lower, spreading through me like wildfire. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just my brain acting strange because I hadn't seen him in years. But the thought persisted, and the more I tried to dismiss it, the stronger it became. I kept picturing him, how different he looked now, that sharp tone to his deep laugh. I imagined the way he hugged me earlier, how solid he felt under my hands. And before I knew it, I stopped trying to fight the thought. I let it in. My fingers moved lower, losing myself in the warmth that was building. My breathing began to change, shallow and quick, as I sank deeper into the moment. The room felt even quieter, as if the entire world had vanished, leaving just me and this intense feeling growing inside me. And then there he was again in my mind, Brad. This time, I didn't try to stop it. I imagined his hands, strong and sure, brushing against my skin. His voice, low and teasing, saying my name. It felt so vivid, as if he were there with me, and I couldn't help but give in to the fantasy. My body reacted instantly. The way my fingers moved, the way my body arched, everything felt electric. Every nerve in my body was alive, and the warmth I'd felt before became something I couldn't ignore. It was a perfect mix of comfort and excitement, like experiencing something new but safe at the same time. And let me tell you, it wasn't just physical, there was an emotional intensity to it as well. Maybe it was the fact that Brad had been such an important part of my life growing up. Or maybe it was the shock of seeing him again after so long, looking and acting like a completely different person. Whatever it was, I felt powerful. I gave myself over to the moment completely. Surrendering to the sensation, my hands moved with more confidence, and my breathing grew heavier. The image of Brad in my mind became clearer, his hands on my waist, his lips brushing against my ear. It was forbidden. His hands on my waist, his lips brushing against my ear. It was forbidden, of course. I mean, this was Brad, the boy I used to look after when I was 14. But that's what made it even more intense. It felt so wrong. Yet at the same time, I felt it was something I couldn't resist. The memory of his laughter, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. It all came rushing back, but now it was wrapped in this new attraction I didn't know how to handle. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside my window. The air felt heavy, almost charged, as I let my thoughts spiral deeper. Every touch sent shivers through me, and every thought of him made my heart race faster. But just as I was completely lost in the moment, something inside me wavered. A small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "What are you doing? This is Brad." It was like a splash of cold water, and for a brief moment, I paused. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of what I was feeling. But then, as quickly as the doubt had come, it faded. I told myself it was just a fantasy, just a way to unwind after a long day. There's nothing wrong with that, right? So, I closed my eyes again, letting myself sink back into that warm and electric haze. This time, my fingers moved with purpose, and I let the fantasy take full control. There was no hesitation now, just the sound of my breathing, the softness of the blankets around me, and the vivid image of Brad in my mind. I imagined everything. The way his hands would feel, big and warm, but with that roughness that comes from working out. I thought a lot about his voice, low and teasing, saying my name in that way that sent shivers down my spine. And his eyes, God, I couldn't get his eyes out of my head. They were a mix of mischievous and calm, as if they always held some secret he wasn't sharing. And that's what it was. It felt forbidden, like I was crossing some invisible line. But that only made it more intense. My body was fully in tune with the moment. My breathing was ragged, and I was so close to, well, you know. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, my bedroom door swung open with a bang, no knock, no warning. All I heard was the loud crash of the door hitting the wall. "Scarlett!" Brad's voice cut through the air like a slap. "Let's get drunk." I froze, completely froze. my entire body flipped. My brain short-circuited, and I just lay there like a deer caught in headlights. And Brad, oh my God, he was standing there. His eyes went wide as he realized what he'd walked into. He froze. The silence was deafening. I could see the exact moment his brain caught up with what was happening. His jaw dropped, his face turned bright red, and he just stood there completely still, frozen. He didn't even try to look away. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, like his whole system had shut down. And me, I was still lying there like an idiot, completely. I was exposed, not physically but emotionally, which somehow made it feel even worse. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It was like my brain refused to process the situation. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the gears in my head started turning again. "Brad, what the hell?" I shouted, my voice coming out much louder than I intended. He snapped out of his stupor and quickly started rambling. "I didn't know." "You never lock the door," he replied, sitting up and grabbing a pillow to cover myself, even though I was fully dressed. My heart was racing, but not in the good way anymore. Brad's face was still a deep shade of red, but then he smiled. That little smirk curled at the corner of his mouth, and I swear I wanted to throw something at him. "Maybe you should put up a sign or something," he said. He walked out of the room with his hands up, like he was surrendering. "Just saying." And then the little idiot laughed, a full-on laugh, as if he hadn't just barged in on the most embarrassing moment of my life. He closed the door behind him, and I could hear him running down the stairs, still laughing to himself. I just sat there, completely stunned. My face was burning. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out. But then, and this is the part that surprised even me, I realized the whole thing had, I don't know, affected me in a way I didn't expect. Because as I sat there, replaying what had just happened, I couldn't stop thinking about the look on his face. That moment when he froze, his face. That moment when he froze, his eyes wide, his mouth open, burned into my memory. And instead of feeling mortified, I felt a strange spark, like he had seen me. Not just physically, but in that raw, unfiltered moment. And as much as I hated to admit it, that turned me on even more. The shame was still there, of course, but it was mixed with an electric excitement I couldn't shake. My brain kept going back to him standing in the doorway. The way his expression shifted from shock to amusement. It was as if the tension between us had hit a boiling point, and now there was no turning back. I tried to push it aside, to focus on anything else, but it was useless. The image of him standing there was seared into my mind, and every time I thought about it, that spark turned into a full-blown fire. I spent the next few hours just pacing around my room, trying to calm down and make sense of what I was feeling. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something had shifted. It wasn't just about attraction anymore. It was about him. Brad wasn't just some abstract fantasy. He was real. The boy I'd grown up with. The one who used to annoy me to no end. The friend I hadn't seen in years. I couldn't deny it anymore. I wanted him, and not just in an abstract or fantastical way. I wanted him. The entire next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. No matter what I did, my thoughts kept drifting back. Not just to the embarrassment, but to something else. Brad, on the other hand, acted as if nothing had happened. He was completely normal, cracking jokes during breakfast and scrolling through his phone, while Mom talked about a new recipe she wanted to try. It was like the whole incident hadn't even registered with him. Meanwhile, I sat there, barely able to make eye contact, feeling like I might die on the spot. I spent most of the day avoiding him, which wasn't easy in such a small house. I helped Mom with the laundry, caught up on some emails, and tried to distract myself with a book I'd been meaning to finish. But no matter what I did, my mind kept returning to him. Later in the afternoon, Dad called me into the living room. He and Mom were sitting on the couch, looking like they were about to drop some kind of news. "We're heading out tonight," Dad said. "Your grandparents need some help with a few things, so we'll be staying over there. Probably late, but we'll be back first thing in the morning. We'll celebrate your return properly tomorrow." "All right," I nodded, trying to sound casual even though my heart had suddenly started racing. Brad was sitting on the floor across the room, flipping through a magazine. Dad called out to him next. "Brad, you're in charge while we're gone, okay? Don't burn the house down." Brad looked up and grinned. "No promises, but I'll try." Mom laughed, and they started gathering their things to leave. Within 10 minutes, the house was quiet again. It was just Brad and me. At first, I tried to stay calm. I stayed in my room, scrolling through my phone, pretending I wasn't acutely aware of every sound he made. I could hear him moving around downstairs, the clink of dishes as he grabbed something from the kitchen, the faint hum of the TV as he settled down to watch something. But the longer I stayed there, the more restless I felt. The events of the night before were still fresh in my mind, and my body practically buzzed with tension. And honestly, I wanted more. It was like some kind of switch had flipped inside me. I wasn't thinking about whether it was a bad idea or what might happen if things got awkward. All I knew was that I wanted him, and I wasn't going to let myself overthink it this time. I waited until it got dark and the house was silent, except for the faint sound of the TV downstairs. Then, when I couldn't take it anymore, I did what I had to do. I snuck out of my room and crept down the hallway to Brad's room. The door was slightly ajar, and when I peeked inside, I saw him lying on his bed, fast asleep. He was on his side, facing away from the door, with one arm tucked under his pillow. I hesitated for a second. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake him. But the longer I stood there, the stronger I felt that surge of courage, or maybe recklessness. I slipped inside and quietly closed the door behind me. The room was dark, lit only by the soft glow of his desk lamp. I could hear his slow, steady breathing, and it made my own breath catch. Carefully, I climbed onto the bed and lay down beside him. My body practically vibrated with nerves, but I couldn't stop myself. I mirrored his position, lying on my side, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. For a moment, I just lay there, letting the tension build. The silence, the stillness was intoxicating. My mind was racing, but my body seemed to know exactly what to do. I wanted him. I started to move, just a little, inching closer to him. My hand brushed against his, and he shifted slightly in his sleep, but didn't wake up. My heart was in my throat, but I kept going. And then he turned over. His eyes fluttered open slowly, blinking as he tried to process what was happening. When he saw me, his face changed. Groggy confusion gave way to pure shock. "Scarlett, what are you doing?" His voice was rough with sleep. At first, I didn't say anything. I just reached out, grabbed his hand, and placed it against my waist. His hand was warm, strong, and for a second, he just froze, staring at me like he couldn't believe what was happening. "This is your fault," I whispered softly, my voice barely more than a breath, "for walking into my room without knocking." He looked at me with an expression that was a mix of confusion and something else, something I couldn't quite place. But then, slowly, he relaxed. His hand moved on its own, sliding against my side, and I saw the moment he gave in. For a moment, everything felt surreal. His hand hovered over me, unsure, trembling even. I could feel the hesitation in his touch, the kind of nervous energy that comes when someone steps into completely uncharted territory. His palm rested gently, his fingers trembling slightly. At first, I wasn't even sure if he was going to go through with it. He looked at me with that gaze, a mix of confusion, fear, and curiosity. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was probably wondering if he should run, laugh it off, or lean into whatever this was. And honestly, I could barely keep it together. But then, something shifted. I gave him a small nod, silently telling him it was okay, that I wanted this, that he didn't need to overthink it. That tiny gesture of reassurance seemed to be all he needed. His hand started to move, cautiously at first, as if he were testing the waters. His fingers brushed against my side, warm and firm, but still hesitant. I could see the uncertainty in his face, but there was determination too. He wanted to do it right, even if he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing, and somehow that made it even more intense. His hand grazed my skin, and I couldn't help but let out a shaky breath, a trembling breath. It wasn't just the physical sensation, it was the way he was putting so much effort into it, the way he was clearly trying to read me, to figure out what felt good and what didn't. There was something so raw, so vulnerable about it. I kept my hand on his chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. His skin was warm under my palm, and I could feel the faint texture of muscle beneath. His chest was broad, solid, and I couldn't help but notice the faint veins running along his arms, visible even in the dim light. The nervousness eased as he got more involved. His movements became more confident. More deliberate? He wasn't fumbling anymore. He was paying attention. He watched my reactions and adjusted to them, and honestly, he was doing an amazing job. I couldn't help but smile a little, even as my body tensed with anticipation. There was something so endearing about the way he approached this, as if he were discovering something entirely new, yet putting his whole heart into it. It wasn't perfect, of course. There were moments when his inexperience showed, when he hesitated or faltered a little. But the effort he was putting in, the way he was so focused on making this a good experience for both of us, made up for everything. And for me, it was overwhelming in the best way. Every sensation felt amplified, as if my entire body was in sync with him. The room felt hotter, the air thicker, and I could feel an electric current running between us. It was so much more than I expected, so much more intense than anything I'd felt in a long time. Brad's confidence grew with every passing second. His movements became smoother, more assured. I could see the change in him, the way his fear began to fade, replaced by something bolder. And as for me, I was completely lost in the moment. It was as if everything else faded away, the awkwardness, the hesitation, the fear of what this might mean. All of it disappeared. The only thing that mattered was him and the connection we were building, the way we were both fully present in this moment. And then it happened. That emotion, that wave of pure sensation that took my breath away. It was 5 times stronger than anything I'd experienced before. Maybe because it wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. The way he looked at me, the way he was clearly trying, the way we were both diving into something completely new together. I let out a trembling laugh, resting my forehead against his. "You're better at this than I thought," I said teasingly, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and a mix of pride and relief crossed his face. "Didn't think I'd survive this," he admitted, his voice just as quiet. We both laughed, and the tension between us dissolved into something warmer, something lighter. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't just about what had happened. It was about him, so instinctively, I leaned toward him. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was a subtle, slow movement. I wanted to give him the chance to pull away if he needed to, but he didn't. His eyes settled on my lips, and that was all the encouragement I needed. Our lips met softly at first, almost testing the waters. His were warm and surprisingly soft. There was hesitation in his kiss, as if he still wasn't sure if this was really happening. But as the seconds passed, that hesitation began to melt away. He tilted his head slightly, and I pressed against his chest, kissing him with a little more confidence. And I felt that familiar rush of him, a torrent of emotions coursing through me. I didn't know what it was about Brad. Maybe it was the fact that this felt so forbidden, so unexpected. But everything about him in that moment was driving me wild. I could feel his inexperience in the way he kissed me, the way he was clearly figuring it out as he went. But somehow, that made it better, more genuine. I decided to take control. I pushed him gently, guiding him until he was lying back on the couch. His eyes widened for a second, but he didn't resist. I climbed on top of him, straddling his waist, and I couldn't help but smile at the way he looked at me, half nervous, half amazed, like he couldn't believe this was really happening. "Relax," I murmured, running my hands over his chest. His shirt had ridden up slightly, revealing a strip of toned skin and the faint lines of his abs. I traced my fingers along that line, feeling the way his muscles tensed under my touch. He started to say something, but I cut him off with another kiss. This one was deeper, more intense. I could feel him relax beneath me, his hands moving tentatively to rest on my hips. The kiss grew hungrier, more passionate. My fingers tangled in his hair, tugging lightly, and I felt him shiver beneath me. His hands tightened on my hips, and for a second, I wondered if he was finally going to take control. But he didn't. He just looked at me, completely lost in the moment, letting me lead. And honestly, I loved it. There was something so empowering about being the one in control, guiding him through this experience and watching the way he responded. His breath hitched every time I moved. Every time I shifted or ran my fingers over his skin, it was intoxicating. Knowing I had that kind of effect on him seemed to give him a small boost of confidence because his hands started to move more freely, exploring. I could feel the change in him, the way he was finally starting to let go of his nerves and just enjoy the moment. And for me, it was incredible. Every touch, every kiss, every small movement, everything felt more intense, more heightened. I don't know if it was the forbidden nature of it, the adrenaline, or just the fact that it was him, but I felt like I was on fire. Our kisses became more passionate, more desperate. I could feel his heartbeat against mine. His chest rose and fell rapidly as we lost ourselves in each other. My touch craved him so much, but of course, this complete nerd didn't have protection, and at that moment, I didn't dare. Well, you'll understand. So I slid down to his feet, kneeling and, for God's sake, with a feeling of trust that was slowly building between us. There were no expectations, just the understanding that we were exploring this moment together, feeling each other, literally and emotionally. His reaction seemed genuine, a little nervous, but also deeply engaged in the experience. It was clear this was new for him, and I respected that. I didn't push him. Honestly, what do you think? Should I feel guilty? Tell me in the comments what you think. Don't judge me too harshly, just tell me what you would have done. I'm reading.